Perfect. I think we went live. So welcome, everyone. We appreciate you joining us for today's presentation. We're so glad that everyone was able to register and sign on today. My name is Melanie McGacken, and I'm here on behalf of the Rutgers Community Living Education Project Team, also known as CLEP. And we are a project that is supported through the New Jersey Division of Developmental Disabilities. Before we get started today, just a quick few housekeeping notes. This session is being held in webinar mode, so everyone's microphone and camera, besides our presenters, will be turned off for today's session. Please know that if you want to ask a question live, that we can unmute your microphone at the end of the presentation. Also, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat feature in your Zoom control panel at any time throughout the presentation. And we'll attempt to answer all questions at the end of today's webinar, as long as they are topic specific and not looking for highly personal information. And if you experience any technical issues, please feel free to drop a message in the chat, and someone from our team will be happy to assist you. So today's title is Growing Together, Supporting Sibling Bonds Across the Lifespan. Siblings of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and/or intensive needs often experience a unique blend of joy, responsibilities, pride, and challenges. This presentation will explore the emotional dynamics within sibling relationships, everything from love and connection to stress, uncertainty, and at times even resentment. We'll hear of practical ways that families can strengthen these relationships by fostering understanding, communication, and by providing mutual support. Today's presenters will discuss both proactive and responsive strategies to help siblings feel seen, valued, both now and in the future as they grow into adulthood. We're honored to be joined today by our presenters from Behavior Therapy Associates, Dr. Bianca Coleman and Dr. Jennifer Cruz. We're grateful to have their expertise being shared with us today, and we know that you'll find this session both meaningful and informative. So thank you again for joining us. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's get started. And without further ado, I would like to welcome both Dr. Coleman and Dr. Cruz. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Melanie. That was great. So we're going to start off. I'll be doing the first half of the presentation, and my colleague, Dr. Coleman, is going to take the second half. So I'll be, in some ways, setting us up for some of the backgrounds and what we know about the sibling relationship and how having a sibling with a disability can impact dynamics. And then we'll shift it over to Dr. Coleman to talk about interventions and strategies for how to bolster those relationships and improve those dynamics as best we can. So, but before I jump into more of the presentation, I did just want to make a note to discuss language with you all today. So you may hear a shift between identity first versus person first language. And that's really just because we know that there's so many differences as far as what people prefer and how they refer to themselves or they refer to a sibling or family member. So you may hear a shift between those two throughout the presentation. So we just want to honor everyone's perspectives. So you, just to give everyone a heads up about that. And you may also see me make some type of nonverbal cue to have Dr. Coleman press the next slide because she's handling that today. So if I do a wave, please disregard. So to get us started off, we wanted to really highlight that we feel like this is such an important topic because they offer a really unique perspective when we think about an individual, not just with a disability, but any individual, right? Because sibling relationships are the relationships most of us have throughout the duration of our lives, and they can be really meaningful and influential in a lot of different ways. Because there's a lot of shared experiences or shared backgrounds, even genetics, if we assume the sibling relationship is biological, and shared practices from parenting approaches or sometimes cultural experiences. And then there's a lot of differences too, where even though they might be in the same household, they may have very different experiences that aren't always that each sibling doesn't experience the same way. And especially when we're considering siblings of someone with a disability, they have very different needs. And that could significantly impact the relationship. So we wanted to explore that a little bit further, particularly for folks who have siblings with either intellectual or developmental disabilities or significant medical issues. So, just to look at sibling outcomes in general, we wanted to give a background about what we know, what the research tells us. And what we see when we're thinking about typically developing siblings, so those of whom who do not have a disability but maybe have a sibling with a disability, they can have a mixture of positive and negative outcomes, and that depends on a lot of different factors. But there does seem to be some trends that they may have an increased number of mental health challenges compared to their typically developing peers who have typically developing siblings. And at times they've been shown to have poorer adjustment outcomes. And in addition to that, there's also some extra risks. So there's the exposure to behaviors by their sibling that may be just unpredictable or even at times aggressive or physically violent or dangerous. There's in family and environmental risks. So there might be just increased inconsistency in routines, high family stress, a lot of burnout. There's social risks. Does the community know about their sibling or about their sibling's disability, and how does that impact them? And emotional risks as well. So lots of feelings related to things like guilt or resentment that can come about because of the factors or the setting scenarios, if you will, surrounding their sibling and what their behaviors are like, what their family dynamic is like. So we wanted to, we looked at a few different kind of research articles to look at what are some potential risk factors. And this was a relatively recent study that looked at 69 articles that focused more so on siblings who have their siblings have an autism spectrum disorder. And what they noted was that across the board, they saw some general trends, and they noted that siblings of those who have ASD siblings fared worse on certain outcomes. So noting higher levels of internalizing behaviors like anxiety and depression, more difficulties with social functioning, poorer dynamics in their sibling relationship, and their beliefs were also somewhat skewed. So beliefs that in this case was a very broad category. So they had things like a poorer self-concept, so how they viewed themselves. Their beliefs about their sibling disability was sometimes not accurate or flawed, if you will. And just beliefs about the world. So whether they felt like the world was something that could be trusted or safe. So they had some variation there, and that was tended to be somewhat worse compared to siblings that were viewed with who did not have an ASD sibling. On the flip side, though, there were notable areas that we didn't see a difference, and those were in the areas of adjustment, in the areas of attention and hyperactivity, in coping, and in family functioning. So this was something that we thought was noteworthy because while you see these kind of two chunks of where they fared worse and where they didn't, what we continued to see, even through looking additionally at more research, is that these findings are not always consistent. And there's just a lot of variability within the sibling community. So you might see, yes, some general trends, but there's so much influence and a lot of other factors that play into this that suggest that it could really vary. So we want to be considerate of that when we're thinking about how might having a sibling with a disability impact the other sibling and their relationship. So, speaking to those factors, some of these were highlighted as areas that could really make a strong point here in as far as what could influence those sibling outcomes and where we might see the siblings either show challenges or show strengths. And what we found when we looked into this was that there were several components here that contributed to whether the outcomes were better or worse. So that top one shown up quite a bit, which was the severity of the symptoms related to the disability. So if you have a particular sibling who has really significant behavioral needs or medical needs, the severity of those contributed to whether or not the other sibling um, contributed to their outcomes. Level of understanding about the diagnosis. So did the sibling fully have a grasp on their brother or sister who has a disability and what it means and what it looks like, what the prognosis is? Do they have a clear understanding or do they not? Their coping strategies and how many they have, how often they use them, if they're positive and healthy strategies or if they're not. Social support and the level of social support from whom, all of those contributed to their outcomes. Parental mental health. So how were the parents in these family dynamics using coping strategies or managing when it came to their child with a disability? And level of family communication. So the degree to which there was openness and free-flowing dialogue about what was happening in the home, especially as it related to the sibling with a disability versus not, were all key contributors to what we saw as what was discovered in the research. And then I think something else to consider too about understanding a diagnosis and how other people perceive it is whether or not that disability is considered what one might call invisible, right? So is that something that everyone can see and it's very clear, versus it's something that is not always observable or present, and that can make level of understanding a little bit more challenging. So we wanted to look into the various impact across settings because we thought that that would be helpful, especially from a lifespan perspective when we're thinking about young children who have siblings with disabilities all throughout adulthood. So at home, we saw that even when we're thinking about potential impact, what might having a child with a disability look like and how that might impact their siblings. Um, if we're thinking about parental mental health, as I mentioned earlier, then we're thinking about how does the parent manage demands and balance routines, expectations, as well as the specific needs of their child with a disability and their child without a disability. Um, we looked at, there's concerns around whether they're providing enough emotional support for and discipline for all of their children, and is it being delivered in a way that's developmentally appropriate for each child? Do they model appropriate coping styles? And if parents are struggling with their own mental health and are not using coping strategies that are helpful, then that could impact how a sibling is using their own coping strategies. And then there's some other challenges as far as what do we see in those homes? Well, there could be less open communication, so less willingness to talk about if there's behavioral concerns or specific challenges, and everyone's just trying to get through the day. And this is by no means to say that parents are at fault or caregivers are at fault through all this. It's just noticing and being aware of the fact that sometimes these trends can happen when we're seeing these dynamics with someone who has a disability, especially when their needs are significant as far as behavioral or medical needs. And then changes in the roles and responsibilities of the sibling, which we'll get to in a little bit. For school, especially impact on the sibling, there could be so many different variations that happen. So changes in sleep schedules. What happens when there's difficulty sleeping and where there's a lot of expectations or responsibilities happening and sleep schedules are all off, or there's some type of issue and everyone's woken up really early. And a lot of the logistics around school. So pickups, drop-offs, this is assuming, whether they're attending the same school or whether maybe they're each attending different schools for whatever reason. And all of that can impact the sibling without a disability because they're needing to adjust and adapt to a lot of these other expectations. There could be performance difficulties or regression as far as academic performance at school due to mental health challenges, should a child present with them. And then there's also the social impact. Sometimes children with siblings who have either an intellectual, developmental disability feel isolated because they don't know that anyone else really has that similar experience. Or they may experience bullying or stigma, or they watch their sibling experience that. And that can really be impactful, especially in that school setting. There may also be some more parentification if they're attending the same school, for example. So serving as the mediator or protector for their sibling when it comes to other interactions. And then in the community, we're looking at safety concerns, right? So if we have a sibling who has a tendency to elope, for example, or whether that's traffic or in crowded areas. So what would that look like if family outings are impacted by potentially some behavioral issues? Is there a tendency for the family to not go out or to choose certain environments over others because they're trying to adapt to the needs of the sibling with a disability? Maybe it has to do with sensitivity regarding sensory stimuli as well, and that's why those decisions are being made. But in the from the perspective rather of a sibling, what does that mean for them? Are they being having to adapt and having to accommodate to the those decisions because we're trying to accommodate for the sibling who has those particular needs. So those community dynamics, that could impact them as well. And then a lack of acceptance in the community. So do other people have opinions or make comments? How do they feel in those spaces as siblings? Is there a sense of embarrassment? Is there a sense of anger or injustice that happens? Those can be impactful here too. And then financial constraints. So, is there opportunities to participate in community events when we're thinking about, as a family, if there's a child with needs who require a lot of supports, that can place a burden on the family's finances and what they're able to do, and therefore what the sibling is able to do. So, to look more clearly about the changes or the perspectives of the sibling across the lifespan, we looked at a few different areas, right? So, what kind of presents itself, or what their perspectives are for a sibling who, when they're in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and how they're viewing their sibling with a disability. So, at first, for young children, they might express or notice something different about their sibling, but not really able to verbalize it. They know that maybe there's something different about their play, they're different about their behavior. They may be confused about whether or not the condition is something that is, is this something their siblings born with? Is it something that they could develop themselves? So there might be a lot of confusion around that. They may also have difficulty understanding their siblings' feelings towards them. Like if, for example, if there's a child with autism or a child who has physical behaviors, and can sometimes, engage in more aggressive behaviors, could that sibling view this dynamic and say, oh, clearly my brother or my sister doesn't like me, and may not be able to differentiate between the diagnosis and the behaviors that are associated with that and the actual sibling dynamic and their feelings towards them. But children also can serve as early role models of coping and social interaction, and that goes both ways. And then for adolescents, there's a lot of change because now they're in this more identity growth area. There's certainly more exposure to social cues and understanding, so they may be recognizing how others perceive their sibling, how their dynamics and their relationship with their sibling and the types of things they do for them form their own identity. But we wanted to especially highlight that for teens, there could be more so an increased need for support and autonomy, even from those outside of the family. And then for adults, there tends to be a trend that siblings are influenced, their careers are influenced by um, their experience with having a sibling with disabilities who may be going into more healthcare professions or helping professions. And then levels of stress and anxiety come up as well because they may be put into a position where there's the possibility of they're entering into a caregiving role, which they may or may not feel prepared for. And so that comes up as far as like questions and thoughts related to what their experience is like. And that can be kind of a common factor here. So when we're thinking about just looking at siblings' perspectives and their quality of life, I just wanted to highlight a few here because this was a study that looked at just under 50 articles exploring the quality of life of siblings who have um, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, cerebral palsy, or some other genetic conditions. And so they looked at some common themes that showed up, and what they noted was some interesting information. So, as far as, for example, family interactions, they found that those family interactions can shape a sibling's quality of life in both positive and negative ways. So there could be times where they feel really close to all members of the family, including their siblings, but then sometimes not, especially when the family dynamics are focusing and centering the experience of the sibling with a disability rather than acknowledging everyone equally. Um, but they also noted too that family interaction can really influence the relationship if parents are insisting on a certain dynamic. So the key takeaway for this is that a sibling relationship is really important to consider within the family context and can't really be parsed out of that because there's a lot of influence there. But noting as far as the sibling relationship is that they tend to, siblings with and without disabilities tended to have unique, long-lasting relationships regardless. And whether or not your sibling had a disability or specific needs, commonly there was ambivalent or mixed feelings involved. And that was cited as common, again, with or without, whether, if you had a sibling with a disability or that was typically developing. So it wasn't too unique as far as, just because a sibling had a disability or not. And then as far as things like identity, oftentimes they reported positive influences on their siblings' personality, citing themselves as more mature, patient, and empathetic with others. They noted in terms of their well-being that oftentimes their emotional well-being was influenced by whether their parents viewed and accepted their siblings' disability, because that helped them cope and be able to recognize their role in what was happening and the dynamics. But what was commonly cited as a strong influence on emotional well-being was the behaviors or the significant medical issues of their siblings, and that impacted their emotional well-being. And then as far as needs and desires, a lot of sibling citing wanting to be a good role model. and really wanting to share their experiences with other people who had siblings with a disability. And then as far as the support related to disabilities, many of these siblings also cited wanting better and more care or services for their siblings and not having a clear understanding of how they could be involved, to what extent they would be involved, or how to approach support. So just again, some common things that were noted across the board. And here I just wanted to highlight briefly that when going back to emotional well-being, these were the commonly cited or most referred to negative feelings that the siblings had suggested. Um, and I should mention this was a really wide range of folks that were tapped. So we're talking age, I believe, age 4 to age 80 across the board. It was about 900 siblings that were looked across all these articles. So these were the common negative feelings. So things like frustration, sadness, resentment, embarrassment, guilt, stress were commonly noted. There we go. Thanks. But then on the flip side, these were the most referred to feelings that were positive in nature. So a lot of siblings noted pride and admiration of their sibling with a disability, high levels of joy and in their experience together, and gratitude for the experience they were able to have with them. So there was, again, this mixed bag of the types of emotions that were experienced. And then one last kind of area I wanted to note as far as this particular topic is that when we look at that roles and responsibilities, that they noted that their roles and responsibilities were quite different and changed with age. So at first, it started off as they were in this friendship role. So being able to be a translator or, mediator for their sibling, being protective of them, how to engage in like fun and confident, interactions. And then it would shift into more of a caregiving role. So sometimes it could be almost equal to the level of caregiving that their parents were giving at times. But this began in childhood or could have began then. And then realizing that this sort of shifted as the nature of the child's their siblings' disability or needs changed. And there was this transition that took place from caregiving from parents to siblings that tended to happen. And then shifting into advocate, so being able to stand up for their sibling, not just their rights, but their interests as well. And this could be over all areas, advocating for them in the family system or in the larger community. And then at times they felt some feelings of incompetence because not really knowing how to or trying their best to advocate while also managing their own experiences and needs as well. And then that last kind of component of a role is the legal representative. So some siblings cited the shift into being a legal guardian and the challenges that came with that. So the information or lack thereof they were given about guardianship or how to make decisions for their sibling and what that looked like. And so briefly, the last thing we wanted to look at was impact that some siblings had shared in terms of how their relationship with their either autistic sibling or sibling with some other condition like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, how it impacted them. And so it looked at across these areas. So the first was, whoop, you can go to the next slide. That's fine. Sorry, I shook my hand. Didn't realize that was the cue. My bad. So here, if we looked at on the left, in the left columns are some of the positive impacts that were cited, and in the right columns were adverse impacts. So under the category of self and personal development, again, they noted some improvements on, or that they felt they had increased empathy, better ability to cope and compromise, more positive emotions. But on the flip side, they cited some adverse impacts of having additional responsibilities that went beyond what they felt they were capable at that time. and then express concerns about their future, not just for themselves, but for their sibling. And then on the positive, for interactions, right? Again, pride and appreciation, enjoyment of play. So they oftentimes viewed their relationship as typical and not really anything too different from a relationship between two typically developing siblings. But on the flip side, they had often cited some concerns or some challenges with problematic or unpredictable behavior, and then those emotional challenges that came with those behaviors. And then as far as interaction with others, a lot of gratitude, especially when they received support from others outside of the family. But on the flip side, some adverse impact was sometimes there were negative feelings or difficulties with friendships and social life because of their the interactions with their sibling. And sometimes they experienced different parenting experiences, which didn't always have the best or the most positive impact according to them. And then as far as coping, again, ability to compromise, more strategies to cope, whereas, but sometimes some of these siblings cited that they didn't always have the most ideal strategies. So to wrap up my portion, a huge piece is that having a sibling with disability doesn't necessarily guarantee certain outcomes, but there might be specific traits, subgroups, factors that influence how outcomes may show up, and that certain people may be at greater risk. But there's also a lot of information to tell us that there's positive outcomes and as well as potential adverse ones. And so if we consider the interventions and the supports that we can put in place, that's more likely to set up these individuals for success.
All righty. I apologize for my subpar slide advancing skills there. I got a little trigger happy. So thank you for following along with us, everybody. And I will preface my slides as well with just saying, due to said technical hiccups, I'm going to be switching my view back and forth a little bit here between the slides and my notes, just because we're operating here in Google Slides, which if anyone knows, it's always a good time. But I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you, Dr. Cruz. So now that we kind of have an overall picture of outcomes, both areas to focus on, continuing to support and intervene, and then positive results, positive coping strategies, things that have arisen that have really been beneficial and welcomed in each other's lives. Now we're going to start talking a little bit about the interventions themselves. How are we monitoring and how are we supporting siblings throughout their lifespan? So first, I want to start out with just, as one should, with just kind of doing a little assessment. Where are we with things before we launch into providing information or setting up supports? I think that it's good to kind of get a barometer, get a baseline, depending on the individual's needs and their levels of understanding. So it's important here that we're beginning with discussions about age appropriateness, right? So age appropriateness of materials and discussion points. And a good rule of thumb, if anyone is joining us that have younger children, is to really start out with what you can see, more concrete points. So the discussion should really circle around things that are observable and things that are concrete, right, as your discussion points for how to move forward. There's no hard line with at this age, this is what you should tell a child, or this is how you should explain. It is very much so specific to your family dynamics and the child's level of understanding and what you're comfortable in sharing as a parent. If you are an older sibling and you're joining us, certainly I think that the same consideration should be made for what is the current level of understanding, and then how to continue the discussion as the development of the individual progresses, right? And the needs of the siblings might change. And that's an important point here is that, there's often a lot of front loading with information, either upon diagnosis or when the neurotypical sibling reaches a point where they are at an appropriate place to receive more information. But as things continue to change and evolve, it's important to keep this level of communication open. And I'll touch upon that a couple times. You want to take in information almost on a very communicative basis. So instead of talking at somebody, you're really having things that are more of a conversation about what did you see? What did you notice? After that happened, sharing feelings, emotions, and things kind of tied to events or changes that might occur with regard to novel experiences, behaviors, placement changes, needs assessments, etc. It's important to examine the patterns that exist within the family dynamic. I know it's hard when you are a caregiver, a parent, or an older sibling to kind of take a step back and see the forest through the trees, but this really does help on an individual level determining where to go next as far as information that's provided or supports or services that are recommended. Um, Within that discussion, it's also important to recognize both of what Dr. Cruz discussed as kind of those bigger, broader categories of, needs and impact versus positive results. So what those interaction patterns look like and results of your kind of assessments and your discussions of how things are going on a day-to-day basis within the home will better fuel what we're recommending moving forward. Other areas to assess and to look at, especially with younger children where they might not be as like reliable as far as reporting goes, is just that emotional and psychological functioning, right? So within this time, we've talked about things like anxiety, things like depression, excessive worry, things like that. Those are less overt features, which might come up with a sibling that aren't as readily kind of reported or observed. So we want to make sure that there are conversations, there are either structured or unstructured ways to kind of continue to assess this with the child or the older individual. And we want to make sure that we're monitoring these carefully over time via screening tools, via conversations, if you're working with a professional or a therapist, different types of interviews, to just make sure that we're monitoring any changes that might exist within the neurotypical sibling as well. Here's my favorite slide. I'm going to be talking about communication quite a bit. And as I had mentioned, with communication, with explanation, with a lot of the sharing of information, it's really front loaded most of the time. So the key here is that consistent and ongoing way that we're talking to our children or our siblings, if you are in the parent role at this point, to make sure that we're sharing the information that is relevant to the time. Everyone's included in this discussion, really. So if there are questions about how things are changing with regard to schedule or needs, if it's appropriate, you might include the sibling with the diagnosis into the conversation. If there are conversations about major life changes, alterations to time, attention, or resources within the home, making sure that the conversations are occurring within the family unit as a whole. Of course, it's going to be appropriate to kind of temper what we're saying or trim down or concretify what we're saying with younger children, but the conversation to include everyone so that they're not feeling out of the loop, so that they're not wondering, so that fear and anxiety about the expectations that are coming because they can sense that something is changing is really key here. When it comes to communication, it's not just about, kind of diagnostic features, things that are going on and changes. It's also about planning and scheduling things in advance. As we know, with higher needs individuals, there's going to be a lot of situations which might result in changes to set events, schedules, or even the family calendar. A lot of shifting between events with one child versus another, a sports schedule versus a therapy schedule. So we want to make sure that the plans are laid out in advance, the discussion is laid out in advance that if A, B, or C occurs, this is what we're going to do. So that again, that's kind of set and out there, right? So we know that there might be some displeasure, some upset feelings, some shock that might occur when plans do change. But if we're outlining plans A, B, C, or even D sometimes, it's helpful to kind of provide the options that would be available if and when that change is needed to occur. Having conversations about how these plans and schedules affect the neurotypical sibling might also be something that you choose to do. What do you think about this? How does that work for you? Do you understand this? What about this works for you? What about this doesn't work for you? Again, the integration into the conversation can be a very empowering tool for the sibling rather than just kind of a wait and see approach as to what might happen. Overall, there might be situations during which you're going to see different consequences being put in place for different siblings, different activities being offered for one child but not another. Parental attention or support may be divided. And again, if we're having conversations about when, where, how, or even why these things are occurring, it is empowering for all parties involved to be a part of that discussion and opens the door to additional dialogue. I got to give myself my own hand signal here. All right, so for some reason, I'm in an editing mode here. Alrighty. So, really, we talked about the why, the opening and clear communication is needed, but what are the benefits, right? So, in addition to that empowerment, we're seeing that the understanding and the acceptance are more readily available and open in the environment. Again, it mentions that availability, or it allows rather, that availability to discuss the unavoidable differences. These things that might exist might seem unfair, but why is the need there? What is the situation that's arising, which is resulting in that change? Again, more information about the why is a very powerful thing at any age. It provides reassurance and validation for the individual, right? So that is an important feature here, the validation. That's a lot of the reason why we wanted to start our talk with some background information about what the wider population is feeling, because that reassurance and that validation helps us drive ourselves to be more open and accepting to the alternatives, to the modifications and the changes that might exist. And again, the empowerment feature here. It's knowledge of what should be expected from both parties, from all parties involved, and what is needed. And for the sibling, this gives them information in advance of the potential roles and expectations that they might be facing, in addition to what their sibling with a diagnosis might be facing. Okay. So this is often an area that we get a lot of questions about. When I'm working one-on-one with families, again, this comes up quite a bit. I'm putting a lot of time and attention into the sibling with a diagnosis, and that's impacting my other child or this other individual in a different way. Or as the sibling, you might be often questioning, looking back into my childhood, all this dedicated time and attention for the one sibling and feeling a certain way about the time and attention that you received. In making very mindful and purposeful, almost scheduled, I know it feels a little contrived, but the dedicated time and attention to the sibling who it does not have higher needs, the neurotypical sibling. What we see is a lot of positive outcomes with what this very simple intervention, what this very simple modification can do. By providing this dedicated time, it's going to mitigate a lot of the risk involved of emotional and psychological distress. It doesn't have to be a time when there's some grandiose activity planned or some special things scheduled. This could just be a conversation, a walk, a sitting and watching a TV show that brings shared enjoyment. So it can be very minor things that are in this dedicated time. The time also reinforces the sibling's self-worth and identity. That self-worth and identity really is one of the key kind of protective factors that we're going to be talking about that drives and solidifies a lot of these features that we're working on bolstering. This time facilitates open communication and time to emotionally process things. We can be very mindful about the time in which these are scheduled. Maybe it's after a tough day, a tougher week, or a period of a lot of instability in the home. Even though it seems like that's the last thing we want to do is kind of, take more time or spend more time doing other things that aren't, driven right towards a goal that we have in front of us. Along those lines, it's still working towards the processing and the bigger goal of having that individual feel supported. The dedicated time promotes better relationships with all family members involved, supports coping skills and resilience over time because, again, there's that time to process through things, to communicate things. And if we're working to support a younger sibling, for instance, we can also be practicing and discussing some of these coping strategies and how, when, and where they can be utilized. For siblings who are a little bit older, this opportunity also is a great opportunity to reduce burnout and parentification, which may or may not exist. The parentification outside of the home settings, as Dr. Cruz had mentioned, the potential is higher there. So, coming home after school and talking about when and where these might occur, and allowing them to kind of process through and debrief, very valuable tools. For this next slide, I want to really highlight how we are going to be working towards prioritizing the care of the caregiver. And this is the caregiver role here I want to talk a little bit about first here. The caregiver role, is going to change throughout the individual's lifetime. If you are an older sibling that's joining us today, this is going to apply to you, as you may or may not be in more of the caregiver role at this point. So we want to make sure that we're speaking directly to you. And then for parents or caregivers of younger children here, again, of course, this readily applies. But regardless, the needs here are vast, and we want to make sure that we're not pulling from the dry well, that we are allowing enough time to take care of ourselves, to allow ourselves the time to process things in order to prevent the strain, prevent the burnout. There's a preservation of mental health that has to occur here, and that directly leads into our quality of life and the quality of interactions with all children, all parties, all spouses, individuals involved, etc. High parenting stress is really strongly associated with a lower quality of life here. You see more of a likelihood for higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of discord within relationships outside of the home. So this is, again, as we're painting the picture as to why this is very important. I know that there is a lot of the times, we're preaching about, caring for yourself and things like that, but really here is a direct function of the why. By providing care for yourself, it's improving the family function and bolstering the ability to support siblings, right? So you're modeling even that self-care. I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to step away for a minute. Or you know what? I'm feeling really burnt out. That was a really long day. I had a lot to process today, and I feel like I need some time to myself. Oftentimes we want to hide those feelings and put on the happy face for all siblings, but we want to make sure that we are at least sharing the why and allowing an opportunity for this to be accepted. It's okay. It's all right to take a break. It's all right to take some time for yourself. It's all right to want to be by yourself, to process through things. Those are all very appropriate skills to model. When caregivers are overwhelmed or depleted, you have very little emotional availability. You want to be able to process through the tough times as much as being present for the wonderful times. So again, we're really working towards the marathon of life, not sprinting through it. There might be times in your child's life or your sibling's life that you want to be more of a present force, really involved. But there's going to be a lot of things that come up along the way that might drag you off the path of self-care. You want to remember that it's about that longevity factor and remaining present for as long as you possibly can, and then stepping back away for those times when you're not able to. Okay, regardless of the age of any party involved from a sibling perspective, we want to really make sure that there is ongoing monitoring and oversight of mental health. Again, kind of going back to some of those previously mentioned less overt symptoms of a challenging situation arise, things like isolation, withdrawal, performance changes, which might come along, like whether you're a school-aged sibling, whether you're an adult sibling, the changes at school or work, the willingness to complete, the more challenging tasks or the higher mental load tasks if you see your child, or if as an older sibling, you feel yourself pulling away from these features, that's, a really important alarm to take notice of. That's the red flag that's kind of waving. It might not be a situation where, oh, I got it, I can handle it, it's just a tough day, but it's important to pay attention to these small slides that might occur. Certainly increases in internalizing behaviors, via verbal reports or observations. If, a teacher or a work colleague, or, a friend's parent is reporting changes, these are things to take note of in younger children, especially. So again, these are all sources of information that you can consult with or check in with, to just continuing that monitoring process. I apologize. I'm just zooming down here. Okay. With regard to ongoing support, one of the best places that we can start with is via psychoeducation. So this is going back to that original slide about communication here. So we get a lot of questions regarding what to tell, especially younger children, what to share with them, etc. I think we have to kind of go back to that original slide and keep these things in mind. What is, for younger children, more concrete and observable, things that they can reference in their mind with the examples that you might be providing with them, versus, avoiding the more abstract concepts, the more unknown concepts, the things that may or may not happen with their sibling. Sticking to the here and the now and what's readily in front of them is a good, safe place to begin. If the questions continue, you can certainly elaborate as appropriate, but keeping the discretion in mind and sticking to more like illustrated and easily understandable facts will be the most impactful and helpful for those younger siblings. Certainly, as individuals get older, you can help them to interpret their siblings' needs and intention, right? So that happened. We're going to process through that. Let's talk about intent. We never want any of the feelings or actions that occur in the home with regard to the sibling that has a developmental or intellectual disability or diagnosis. We don't want them to be interpreted as their own fault, or they don't like me, right? That's something that we're always working to avoid. Now, those feelings might creep in, but where the intervention lies is in that discussion, in that debriefing, in that processing, and really providing opportunities for them to understand concrete things in the environment that have occurred, to help illustrate your point. The progression about ongoing needs of the individual and how it might impact them is a good conversation to have as individuals begin to get older, and they might have to, assume some responsibilities in their siblings' lives. So we want to make sure that we are having those conversations often. And emotional identification is another one to really talk through a little bit, both in the sibling and into the individual who with the behavioral or higher needs challenges, right? So we want to talk through about what happened, how this feeling is sitting with them, and what that potentially could mean outside of the event. Let's see here. And if you feel as though these conversations are getting harder and harder to have, or maybe there is, kind of a pushing away of the sibling with regard to having these conversations, it's important to consider that a family or therapist guiding this language might be a helpful facilitator there, at least to kind of lead you in and open the door for these conversations to occur. That can certainly be very beneficial. So ongoing things throughout the lifespan that we want to make sure that we are targeting. So whether this be within the family unit, if you're working with an additional therapist or care provider, or even having these conversations with the individual's team, whether that be a child study team, an outpatient services team, to talk about things that are coming up and then relate that back to the conversation with the siblings. We want to make sure that we're continuing to discuss and as a family, be willing to explore concepts such as psychological flexibility, all the while kind of being mindful of your own needs throughout this process. creating and maintaining bonds. So despite the ups and downs that might occur throughout the individual's lifetime, we want to continue to bolster and provide opportunities for the siblings to come together and share a period of enjoyment, to continue to create that bond, to keep it present, whether that be periods that, kind of naturally occur, or it might feel less natural and more contrived if we're trying to be more purposeful, if there's been a period of some significant upheaval, or concern, or maybe everyone's just feeling a little bit more disconnected. We might need to structure that a little bit at first. Keeping themselves and their siblings safe, right? So depending on the needs of the individual, if there's a lot of externalizing behavior, things of that nature, I think it's important to consider what this might look like for the family, right? So, oftentimes we see this occurring in situations where there's a lot more externalizing behavior, and outlining and designating that, if your brother or sister becomes escalated, these are some areas that, are good for you to go to keep yourself safe or de-escalate yourself. Or if they are having trouble regulating themselves, the sibling with the disability, we want to make sure that we are providing a safe space for them to go, a safe space for them to de-escalate and things like that. These are conversations which are going to be ongoing if we're in the community, if we're outside of the home, if we're in school. What are some areas that we can discuss to make sure that everyone is feeling safe? And then if there's physical behaviors which might exist, what does this look like? Again, going back to that, the rapport and the bond building, we want to make sure that these relationships are connected via some shared skills or interests. And even if it's a sibling joining in to an activity that their other sibling likes to do and kind of having some parallel time of engagement, it is still a period where connection can and could exist. And then we want to create opportunities for collaborations and assistance. And when I'm talking about that, it goes for both parties. Can you help your brother? Can you help your sister? And then allowing the individual, who might have a developmental or intellectual or behavioral or medical disability, be able to be utilized and helpful in providing assistance to their sibling. Again, we're always creating bonds and thinking about opportunities for collaboration. Alrighty. We wanted to provide you with, and I realize here we're getting to the end of our time, but we wanted to provide you with a variety of resources to consider. There's been a lot of discussion here about bigger, broader areas for intervention and support, and the manner in which you accomplish that can come from a couple different ways. So before you dive in and start pulling things and, kind of investigating further, which I do still recommend, it's important to consider what is needed, and the varying levels of the individual's needs. So first and foremost, the age of the individual, the identification of the diagnosis. So you're going to want to pull different support, different resources, different material at different times. So if you're just receiving a diagnosis or the diagnostic information is newer to the sibling, you're going to want to specifically look at that preliminary information. If you're looking at changes throughout the lifespan when it comes to guardianship, shifting residences, different programming, there might be different levels of support that is needed there to promote understanding and acceptance. Escalations or changes in behavior, support, etc., are going to be ongoing. So continuing to keep a present level of resources, but recognizing that the times in which you might need more or less of those is important to monitor within ourselves as the caregiver. Not one size fits all. You might not be comfortable in all settings. So here we're going to be, providing suggestions such as kind of group work, working with advocacy groups, working with support groups, working with shared interest groups that might have individuals who also have siblings with higher needs. I recommend a lot of the times with younger individuals or adolescents to start with high interest groups and activities, things in the community that are easily accessible, which still allows them an opportunity to kind of grow and develop their social connections and their networks outside of the home, but also is perhaps even an opportunity for the sibling to join. Discussion about discussions, input, and abilities will impact the needs at any given time. So again, you might find that in higher times of stress, having a therapeutic provider available to have more of a discussion, a facilitated discussion with the family, can really promote more of those deeper conversations that either you might not feel prepared for, or you might not feel equipped for, and that's okay. It allows an opportunity for honest and open discussion about the impact that you're currently feeling and that the child or the sibling might be feeling at any time. In addition, really, the resources here, regardless of whatever direction you go in, if it's a one-on-one support, if it's a group setting, if it's a deep dive on information and providing opportunities to kind of learn more through that method, it's all about identification and validation of both their role and then the support of that they could be providing or that they would need in turn. So social connections and things like that are going to be really, really important here. I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly. I apologize. I realize I'm a little bit over. So lower levels of support, as we talked a little bit about in the beginning, are associated with more negative adjustment, right? So the key needs that are built up through social connection are feeling loved and valued and the belonging. That inclusivity in a group or some kind of relationship can be a deeply powerful and protective factor. So we want to create more opportunities for belonging. And then within the family, continuing to build those connections, whether that be through dedicated time and attention from a parent, creating opportunities to enhance a sibling bond, right? All of these things can and should exist. The key component really here is the notion of acceptance, being seen, and really recognizing both individual needs and the needs of the sibling on different levels. I think a great way to talk with younger children about their sibling and their needs is to really talk about things in terms of everyone having their own strengths and everyone having their own areas of need that they require more support. That's always a great jumping off point. Creating connection and learning opportunities, absolutely. I listed here a couple resources that you can seek. There is a huge amount of information sessions. I realize that we're not just specifically talking about autism here, but I wanted to kind of highlight Autism New Jersey as a fabulous model for the type of hub, and we can certainly provide other resources if you reach out to us of that similar nature, but where you have the opportunity for both groups, resources and information that is empirical, that is validated, that is safe in the big world of scary internet research. And then there's also certain online communities for older siblings, such as SibNet and SibShops. There's great opportunities for connection that rely, on individual participation and then group work as well too. And I kind of talked about that last point a little bit there. So really here to kind of wrap up our discussion, I want to make sure that we are talking and highlighting the importance of explicit conversation about future caregiving roles, that we are beginning to have discussions about legal planning early. So this is including things like special needs trust, guardian and decision making, power of attorney, and letters of intent. Financial transparency, again, if this is something that's being considered moving forward, key points should be communicated early, written, and reviewed with the potential caregivers so that they make sure that they're comfortable. We want to respect sibling independence as everyone gets older. So the conversations for how that's going to work with your family and how best to support that moving forward is one that is recommended as well too. I'm going to send out the slides to everyone following our talk, but there's another page here of different areas to kind of seek out your resources. And certainly if there's any questions, I apologize for going over, but certainly if there's any questions, my colleague had to depart, but I am here and available to discuss anything that is needed here as well. So there's more references there. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. We actually have So many beautiful comments coming in from you and
Wonderful.
Dr. Cruz's information that you were able to share. So I do want to recognize the time and expertise that you both shared with us this afternoon. And we will jump into some questions if you're comfortable.
Absolutely. And again, I apologize that Dr. Cruz had to depart, but I'm here as long as you need me.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to just start reading some of the comments coming in and questions. The first one's from Kimberly. She's sharing that my son just asked why he doesn't have autism, but his two younger siblings do. He
Okay.
is attributing it to taking after one parent more than another. How to talk about that and how we really don't. So I guess they're asking how to talk about that with the
Okay.
sibling. If you could share some suggestions if you had.
Absolutely, certainly, and I appreciate that and you sharing the information. So from what I'm understanding, it was a conversation that had arisen as a result of the child wondering, why it was the case that he also did not have, feeling that disparity between himself and his siblings, and kind of how to have those conversations. And that's a great jumping off point and a nice illustration from what we talked about, just with beginning of that conversation. So I think that, first, and I apologize, I don't know the person's name, so I can't speak to you directly, but I think first and foremost, it's really important to sit down and kind of have a conversation to get a baseline of understanding of the diagnosis. And whereas it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to kind of get into the biological factors of it all. I think that if we're talking about an individual child who's on the younger end, to get a baseline level of their understanding, to start having conversations that are both reflective of their siblings' needs and then maybe even his own needs, talking about strengths and how he is seeing his siblings either be successful or having skills or things like that, and then talking about his own. This will open up more of a concrete touchstone for I have different skills and abilities than my siblings do. And, regardless of labels and things like that, I think that it's important to oh, okay. I think that it's important to kind of recognize the unique differences within everybody and letting him know that for this, case example, we're working to help you and support you. And for this is how we help support your brother or your sister, in those ways. So I think kind of, again, depending on the age, if this is a really younger child, that's where I would start with those levels of understanding, and just kind of grow from there and basing it off of like individual questions. It seems like they're a very inquisitive child and they're kind of wondering on a deeper level what's going on. So I think, in that time that you're spending with them to have them start processing through little events during the day and how that might be different from their own experiences could be really helpful conversations to have to get the ball rolling.
Thank you so much. So we have Janet, actually one of our past presenters. So she's fabulous also, just like you. I would suggest everyone going back in our webinar archive and listening to Janet's toolkit presentation. Janet is actually wondering if a behavior event occurs, do you debrief with the sibling, depending on their age, on what happened, what the antecedents or triggers might have been,
Mm.
and what might be done to avoid such an event in the future?
Sure. Yes, I do think, Janet, that it does largely depend on the child's age, and understanding abilities at this time. I think that following the event, there is kind of almost a key window to which we want to have that debriefing occur. Certainly, we want to wait till everyone's, emotions kind of get back down to baseline and we have time to kind of think and process through how we're going to say things, what we're going to say, and then everyone's reactions are from more of that reflective place versus high emotional level. I think that certainly discussing, what had happened, gauging their reactions and allowing for them to talk through what they saw, what they observed, rather than explaining the event to them, might be a good place to start. Oftentimes, siblings will perceive things from a completely different perspective from the parent, and again, depending on their age level. So I think getting that input from them first, is a great way to open it, leaving the door open to, that happened and that was a lot. How are you feeling? Or like, what are some things that you noticed? If there is, with regard to, prevention, I think that, again, depending on the event, it can certainly be a helpful conversation to have. Even identifying, like, okay, well, I noticed that they started to get a little agitated first, and again, I think it's treading very carefully about how we're presenting what happened so that it's a no fault situation, right? That it doesn't place any blame, but it does illustrate facts and answer questions that they might have more fully.
And as a
Did that
parent
get it?
who,
I
oh,
hope that gets at what we're going.
I think
Okay.
absolutely. And I'll share also as a parent who has two children, our oldest does have some very significant stressful times in his life where behaviorally will present. And my daughter, who is a bit younger, um, I love the information that you just gave, and I really wish that I took more of that perspective, right? As our family's lived experiences years ago of the suggestion to receive that information rather than give that information of how the sibling might have perceived that behavior. I think that's really important. That's a great suggestion. So thank you for
And then after the receiving part, of course, like where we go from there is kind of almost directing it, right? So if they take it a very much so upon themselves, they interpret it as they don't like me, they don't like when I help them, that's where we come in and we kind of guide the conversation. You explore other thoughts and emotions that might have come up. Have them look at the situation more externally so that that internalization doesn't linger, beyond the event. And maybe at that point, then you do share some more information. Well, remember, they didn't get a whole lot of sleep. This is the end of the day. They're probably pretty tired. So, you know what? Maybe tomorrow we'll let them have a little rest time by themselves first before we go into family activity time or go into dinner time or whatever. So I think like I said, it opens the door, and from where we go from there, you can go in a couple different directions depending on the age of the individual.
I needed you 25 years ago in my life.
No, no.
So thank you. So next question is coming from Karen. My daughter's 28, lives overseas. We take my son, who's 30, who lives with Karen and her family, to visit the daughter, and she comes to visit once a year or so also. They talk on the phone and FaceTime weekly. We are concerned about in the future how to allow her to keep her life there without too much pressure to concern herself with his advocacy and etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Mhm.
that's a tough situation. And again, like I will join you, Melanie, in speaking from personal experience as an adult, with a sibling who has a high amount of behavioral, needs, that, it is a fine line that we tread. And I think that, having a sibling who is older, there is an additional level of understanding that comes along with that. The willingness to share information and have open communication, I think, is pretty critical at this age. But I think that the conversation ahead of that, even that preliminary step, would be just really kind of sitting down and just being open and honest with, there are some changes that are occurring. Like, what are you comfortable? I want to make sure that I share our journey with you here so that you have an understanding of what's going on with your sibling. But, like I think depending on the needs at the time, I think it would be helpful to have the conversation of, what information would be helpful for you to have. Like, do you want to maybe have like a little check-in time where we're talking about this, like once a week, or do you want updates, while you're talking on the phone? I would keep the time with the sibling as more of like a protective time. So if there is opportunities to kind of protect, like, discuss the progress or the changes that might be occurring at home with the sibling who's living abroad, having that scheduled for a second time. And that might also allow the time for, even as an adult, the dedicated time and attention to talk about that, but then to also spend some time, discussing other things or exploring their own emotions further. Sometimes that sharing between a sibling who is older and a parent at that age, can be just a really powerful thing conversationally. It doesn't have to even involve anything else. So, I think that talking about the level of comfort, to which the information is being received, and then still continuing to a certain degree to share, I think is more helpful than blindsiding with information or overwhelming with just, a big basket full of new things to share, is better to avoid.
And I think when we're talking about future roles of advocacy from a
Yes.
sibling, possibly when a parent no longer is able to provide that advocacy, having those conversations early often
Yes.
is going to be really helpful. Talking to the sibling to see where their comfort is and maybe where they need more support.
Yeah.
Again, I'll speak from my personal experience, and that's not the right right answer for everyone. Our family found it to be helpful to have those conversations when my daughter was at probably in high school, right?
Yeah.
Very gently,
Yes.
very, very small steps, and in hopes not to put the pressure on her,
Right.
but to see what space she was in, where
Right.
she was envisioning that being for her future, but also and I will share that every family is as lucky as we are. We do have a pretty big family, and we were able to reach out to my niece, to one of my nephews, to say, my daughter's got it, right? She's lived this language all of her life. She's
Yeah.
seen us advocate. We've modeled that for her, but I also want to make sure that she feels supported in her future. So
Absolutely.
when you guys stand alongside her as she's leading this journey, possibly one day, if she continues to make that decision. And then also there are other organizations out there. CLEP does not support any organization. I will just share personally, we have used Plan New Jersey
Hmm.
to form a life plan. And we had my daughter, as well as those other people that are going to be supporting her to support him one day, involved in that conversation. And it was a safe space for everyone to really share what they were going to be comfortable doing in the future. So
Absolutely.
I think making sure that the siblings feel supported in
Mhm.
their role of supporting a sibling with the
Yes.
diagnosis is really important.
And I agree. And I do think, I know I'd mentioned that there's like no hard and fast like timelines or rules, but I think as a general rule of thumb, the understanding of the bigger, broader picture kind of does come into play more so for individuals at the high school level. That is a good time for, like you said, the intro talk. We never want to kind of like overwhelm or front load too much of the unknown and things like that, but to have a lead in conversation, to begin to have those steps be discussed gradually, that is a good time to start. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there, Melanie. It is really about not overwhelming with them, but having them still feel supported in whatever journey or life decisions that they take, right? So along with making the decision for what I'm going to do comes a lot of guilt and a lot of reflection. So we can't expect for the conversation to happen, within the confines of a shorter amount of time. And I think that you did a great job illustrating like how those steps can be gradually taken and they can still feel supported.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Listen, I always say, right, I've learned from the people who have traveled this journey before us and what's worked for them. And we've tried to pull little pieces into that in our family and living through many years of trauma and crisis, trying to navigate the situation as best as we could for our family and the significant support needs that were involved. I think, we often, um, my husband and I'll say this term respectfully, had to live our lives by dividing and conquering, right? So at times our family is well blended, connected and loved as we have for each other. We've also had to recognize that we've had to live very different lives at times and to try to dedicate some time to my daughter as my son was
Yes.
requiring a lot of needs. And I think we even pulled that through when we had our in-home therapists coming in, right?
Mhm.
We had some beautiful people, therapists that made sure from a very early age
Yes.
that they were involving my daughter in that process, one, so that she was comfortable
Mhm.
interacting with my son. But the other part that I felt so grateful for is that they didn't have her feel left out of some of those
Right.
themes that they were playing and that
Absolutely.
interaction. And I really look at that as those people recognizing to pull her in at a younger age has allowed her to form such an incredible bond with him, even through some traumatic experiences. Um, but they were conscious to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that really did make a big difference for us when you had the professionals who are
Absolutely.
recognizing this approach.
Absolutely. And it's again, we don't want to pull water from a dry well. It can be very hard and difficult to figure out how to facilitate these conversations and opportunities. So if you have a team of professionals around you that are providing support for the individual, having a conversation about, like what activities, when and where can we pull and make sure that they're still getting that level of support, or, what could be some learning opportunities that give them some tools for their toolbox for interactions and things like that. I always encourage whole family participation when it comes to any therapy, if the therapist is willing.
Absolutely. We have someone asking, how do we advocate for the medical model to shift to a more holistic approach such as this?
So, I think that if you're referencing, kind of the integration and consideration of some of the factors that we talked about in with medical management and therapy and things like that, I think that, really they should always live alongside each other. For the most part, they do, but there might be some times where the emphasis, depending on the heightened needs or the lower needs of the individual anytime, the emphasis to always for it to be present in some form or degree, whether that's facilitated during a therapy session, or whether that is activities at home, for that always to kind of remain a present force. And really the fuel behind that and how do we encourage that? It just comes from just a very clear understanding that this is a priority within the family. And that if that conversation continues to be had with all family members, the therapy team, and anyone else involved in supporting your family, I think that it almost blends the two seamlessly. It is, like I said, unfortunately, becomes less of a priority at times, but I think always kind of keeping that conversation in the game so that there is a level of understanding. It becomes more of like a second nature and integrated within the family. The systems thing, it starts at home, but it often requires, that whole team approach to just make sure that we're continuing to monitor and pay careful attention as we progress.
Absolutely. I think I really love that that Amy was comfortable asking this. She also wanted
Yeah.
to know what Rutgers is doing to get this information out to the professionals that work with the families. So obviously sessions like this through the Community Living Education Project, where our focus is really exploring all options in community living for individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities, specifically individuals in the DDD system. So we do not provide medical supports, but through CLEP, what we do is recognize that there is a need in the community, and then we reach out to professionals through different organizations. Today happens to be Behavior Therapy Associates to share some information on this. With that being said, Rutgers University is ginormous. We do often are not even aware, right, of what all the other departments are doing. So, Amy, feel free to reach out to me. I'll make sure to put my contact information on the screen, and we'll see if how we maybe can better share this information with other professionals. And then she also noted that the medical model typically only focuses on the child with a disability or diagnosis. And so this information and resources often come too late to families after the family is already in crisis. And I 100% agree with
Yeah,
you,
I
right?
do. Yeah.
Again, my son is 27 and we lived that for many years of trying to navigate life without the right supports available in New Jersey at that time, and then also not the right amount of resources available for us to access. When we were able to find the professionals who were willing to take the whole family approach,
Mhm.
that we found to be best practice. So I think
Yeah.
it's great that you are recognizing that this is a need. So hopefully the professionals that you're interacting with can better guide in that direction for you.
We do see a field shift, to really recognizing the importance of, parent support and training alongside their child, and then sibling involvement and the role of facility lead, communication, oh, goodness gracious, community leaders, and school-based services to really make sure that we're working on generalization and providing the supports across all settings. So there is a shift, that has been showing in the literature, and we're seeing in our day-to-day practice. So, I appreciate everybody being here to have this conversation moving forward and continue to advocate.
I saw that Janet put in a link for Sib Shop.
Thank you,
Dr. Coleman,
Janet.
I know that you shared about that. I would say if my daughter was comfortable, feel free to put something in chat. But I think when we accessed Sib Shop, it gave her a safe space to feel supported by
Yes.
peers who were experiencing some of the peers in our group experienced similar situations and I think it allowed her to feel better supported and not alone. So it made some great connections. Even though she's an adult, she still references. We actually talked about Sip Shop last week with her. So it's a
Adults
great
require just as
option.
much continued
Yes.
support as siblings as children do. And like
Yep.
I said, it's important to hold that line and, regardless of where they are in their lifespan, to continue to allow them to feel supported and seen. And yeah.
Perfect. And let's see, my daughter told us she wished we had those discussions in high school. Yep. While we waited until she was in college. And right, and that I always say we do the best we can with what we have knowledge in.
Absolutely.
And but that's great. It sounds like more open communication is happening now. So that's fabulous.
I
Some
do have time
people
for one more question if possible, and then
okay.
anyone is welcome to email me or Dr. Cruz to speak, a little bit more individually if need be. I'm happy to do that as well too. So please feel
Perfect.
free.
Can you talk a little bit about adult siblings who maybe aren't as bonded as the family wants them to be because
Mhm.
of traumatic experiences in the
Yeah.
past? Is there anything that you can offer to a family, to parents, to assist them in working through some of those challenges now that they're adults, but maybe are still holding on to some feelings?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think that, to preface it or to really kind of think antecedent wise, to the beginning wise, I think that it's important to allow opportunities, and rather that be through facilitated family discussion, talking with a therapist, to explore those feelings first, to see, kind of what comes up. Sometimes when we're looking back upon things in more of a reflective sense as adults, we're able to kind of dive a little bit more deeply in certain directions than living in the moment. So I do think that it's important in the situations where there are strained adult relationships, to have ongoing conversations, which kind of help them explore those feelings first. And then, much like we would do for in an instance of younger siblings, is just kind of creating these, and at first they might happen less organically, creating these opportunities for shared enjoyment. If it is smaller amounts at first, larger amounts, assistance seeking and kind of working kind of collaboratively. But again, I think being mindful, depending on the siblings' needs, being mindful of when and where and how that occurs, what activities can be mutually enjoyed and shared, and just kind of promoting the opportunity to, even though these things might have existed, and again, this is where the therapeutic discussion or the family discussion comes into play. How do we move forward and create new opportunities as an adults to bond together, to be together, to feel comfortable with each other, and to enjoy each other's company? And that's just going to be through these little moments of shared enjoyment through activities or conversations.
Thank you again, Dr. Coleman. Please thank Dr. Cruz for us
I
also.
will. I
As we're
will.
preparing to say goodbye today, everyone's going to see a really brief survey pop up on our screen. Takes maybe 30 seconds. It's the information that you provide us that allows us to better schedule sessions that are relevant to our community. Dr. Coleman, please thank everyone at Behavior Therapy Associates. We thank everyone for their time and for joining us, and we wish everyone well and happy holidays.
My
Thank
pleasure. Thank you so much.
you. Be well, everyone. Thanks.